Thanks for joining us on the call. Really excited to talk with you again.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We developed mitochondrial therapies, but I had no idea that there was a link between mitochondria and space until we saw your manuscript.
So with this, you did a kind of multi-omics approach, right? You looked at a lot of different types of data and then sort of came up with mitochondria as the, I don't want to say hub, but how would you describe it, I guess?
Yeah. So I mean, the whole idea for that project was, is there kind of a master switch that would regulate, things that would disrupt your body in space, health-wise. So, when people went on and independently analyzed, did all their, nice computational analysis and fancy analysis, yeah, mitochondrial became the top hit for the pathways and genes that were being dysregulated in space for all the different organs, from like mice that were sent to space, the tissues that were there, or like cell culture from different human cells, that were in this dish that was sent to space. And then, yeah, I mean, it was mitochondrial was the top hit for everything. So,
which is really fascinating. I'm kind of curious why. But before we get into the mechanisms, you had a whole lot of different ways of looking at this. Obviously, you looked at astronauts that have been to the International Space Station. You had a twin study in there, and then you had mice. And is the idea kind of really there are two aspects of space travel that may impact you? One is microgravity and the other radiation, or are there more things to consider?
Yeah, so for space, you got a few hazards that are, people have to consider. Some of the main two that I focus on is definitely you got the galactic cosmos, you got space radiation. So on Earth, we don't experience that because of two things. One is the magnetosphere, which is low Earth orbit, the Van Allen belt. Due to the physics of it, it reduces the dose. So the International Space Station, all experiment centers at low Earth orbit. So the dose they get there over time is a lot less than, let's say, once you leave that, go to the moon or Mars in deep space. So that's one aspect of space radiation. And then you get like these solar particle events, like solar flare from the sun. So you get a high dose of protons once in a while, different energies that people can get exposed to. And on Earth, we don't get that. And the ozone layer protects us from the rest of the reduced radiation that is in the low Earth orbit. So the deep space is one aspect that's really concerning. The other concern is the lack of gravity or microgravity, right? So then, of course, that could the obvious things that could contribute to is bone loss and muscle generation. And then there's other stuff which I haven't focused on as much, but other people do in the field, which is the confinement aspect. How does that affect neurological issues if you're in confinement? Well, because you're basically in a tube, for a long period of time. And then the other part is long distance from Earth. Right now ISS is not that long, because if there's something that goes wrong in the mission, they could easily get someone down within 24 hours or less, down to Earth. And then of course there's the microbial aspect that, again, the biology that might accumulate on the ISS.
Yeah, and that's actually another area where there's quite a bit of overlap between the disciplines. We look at a lot of kind of peripheral biomarkers because obviously you can't probe humans, especially if you're interested in things like the brain or even, muscle, liver, whatever, you can't really biopsy people. So looking at biomarkers in the blood, for example, or urine, even better, saliva, better than blood. The less invasive, the better, right?
Right.
So those are fantastic, and obviously you can look at mitochondrial function in those. So, and that's another thing is looking at the markers before the person goes up, after they go up, after they've been up there, and then coming back down. And it did look like maybe there was recovery after people come back down. Is that fair to say? Do you think that's
yes.
short term or?
Yeah, so on average, they came back down to a lot of them did, but some factors like cholesterol, that's indirectly with mitochondrial stress, and then the lipid accumulation you get due to that, and the fatty acid, like dysregulation for the metabolism, you might get to contribute to, higher cholesterol. Some of those like cholesterol levels never came back down after 6 days. Hopefully they come back down.
And I would think that given now that, spaceflight is becoming more privatized and potentially more popular, we would want to make sure that we can protect people that we send up to space and before we send them up to space, preferably, right? Which is, by the way, not at all how we do healthcare. Usually, we wait until people get sick and then treat them. But hopefully with some of these things where you show that there is already an impact as you go into space, we could maybe have some kind of a preventative approach to keep the mitochondria healthy. And what was really interesting about this from somebody who's interested in mitochondria is that it seems to be kind of the central switch as to other pathways, right? So you see inflammation, and you saw some other kind of behavioral changes as well that followed that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, so one thing to go back to your countermeasure. Yeah. So space is definitely, you want to prevent the damage before. You don't want, because once you're in space. So yeah, the whole terminology is countermeasures, right? And then we try to make that. So the clinical relevance is, yeah, you're 100% right. So if we could, space is basically an accelerated model for aging and accelerated model for mitochondrial dysfunction. So, when you send it into space, the experiments we do, or the samples we get from the experiments done in space, it's something that you could translate easily to the clinic, where, an experiment, let's say, to look at mitochondrial dysfunction in the lab setting or in the clinic might take a year to do. In space will be a month. So now you got a quick answer to, okay, all these mitochondrial dysfunction happens, let's say, for vision loss or, other factors downstream, like you're saying, for, inflammation or immune system dysregulation and things like that. You'll know in a month. And if you stop it from happening there, it should easily be translatable to the clinic, any of the kind of markers or preventatives you use there. So yeah, so mitochondria is a central hub. I mean, I believe mitochondria has all this downstream regulation. Like, for example, as you probably know, when the suppression of mitochondria happens, that could lead to increased inflammation and increased immune system dysregulation. And some of this, or we know like the lipid metabolism is heavily, connected to mitochondrial dysfunction. So you could all the things, let's say non-alcoholic liver fatty disease or lipid accumulation happens in your liver degrades, and then things go downstream from there for a person. That definitely is related with mitochondrial. It's been in the clinic, as you know, it's been shown that that's suppressed. So, I would say probably mitochondria is one of the central hubs of, like, you probably have mitochondrial metal, and then it branches out to different diseases as we go.
And I would think that with something like spaceflight, you can separate those, looking at actually what comes first. And you did in this particular paper, I think you didn't go in with a mitochondrial centric approach, right? You were sort of like, this is a I'm a fan of fishing experiments, so let me just say that. But it is a fishing experiment in a sense, right? You're kind of going in and saying, let me see here's all of this information, all of this omics type of data. Let me see what all, has changed, which I think is, fishing experiments are kind of frowned upon by, particularly by funding agencies who want you to go in with a hypothesis of, I think mitochondria changes, but I think that exposes you to confirmation bias and other biases. So looking at it in a completely kind of unbiased way is a much better approach, right?
I agree 100%. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, we did that exactly. We just basically went an unbiased approach, and as I said, is like, tell me what's the master regulators for each of the different tissues we looked at and different experiments. And I think fishing has a bad name for the science. I agree. So in some fields like this, when people have their bias, that was the point where, before we put out our paper a couple of years ago, there was hints of it. There were some people putting out papers like, oh, mitochondrial dysfunction happens in this certain tissue or this certain tissue, but it was kind of largely ignored. It wasn't the focus, because then people were really, let's say, looking at DNA double strand break damage or DNA double strand repair. It would happen, of course, when radiation happens and these heavy ions go through your cells, it breaks DNA, right? So then people were looking at that and how maybe this might affect things downstream, or they'll look at increased inflammation when happens. They'll do in this specialty, but the whole goal of that fishing experiment is how can we unify it, like a systems biology approach, where you kind of unify everything, look at top down as opposed to bottom up. So I agree. I think fishing has a bad name, and maybe we should use that kind of unbiased approach for more diseases.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I have to admit, as somebody who has thought a lot about aging and mitochondria, and sort of in a different part of my brain, I guess, space travel, I'd never really thought about the fact that we should probably work out some of these details of biological, damage and change and aging before we have, before we can actually really think about sending people up to space for extended periods of time. I think most of us don't think about that. We sort of just think, okay, you go up and you come back down and you're, you're fine. But that may not necessarily be the case if it's for extended periods of time.
So that's the thing. Like, people like me and other folks in the field, that's what we're trying to work on, come up with countermeasures. So that's the whole. There's a bunch of health risks we know that are associated with long-term space travel, and even short-term. You see, like, for example, there's, we know in the long term of the things, there's potential risk of increased cancer risk, which could happen in people that have
Sure.
gone to space for long periods of time. There's cardiovascular issues, which we know can occur, like blood clotting or thrombosis, like reverse. Like that was a paper that came out like New England Journal of Medicine of the small end of astronaut, I think 1 or 2, but they noticed that there's some blood clots that form. Luckily, it caught him in them in time. But let's say they don't catch those blood clots, and let's say you're going to Mars, how are you gonna remedy that when you're halfway to Mars and you can't really have tools to do what you want to do? So people are developing that. We know, for example, which is understudied, renal issues, kidney issues, like kidney stones can they form. So I have a collaborator at University College London, Keith Sue and Ben Walsh, that they're trying to look at that aspect. Looking at kidney stone formation and kidney issues that form, because obviously if you go to Mars 500 days away or 300 days away from Earth, how are you going to resolve a kidney stone issue, which can be detrimental? But that's some health risks. Is like one also called SANS, which is space-associated neuroocular syndrome, which is a newer thing in the past 5-6 years, where people start noticing like there's vision loss that could occur. Not in every astronaut, but they noticed that it would occur in some astronauts for long term. Luckily, a lot of them will resolve when they're back on Earth. But again, you're in deep space. There's a lot more aspects. People think it could be due because of the microgravity effects, and the fluid shifts that happen, and the changing in the eye pressure and things like that. I think, since we're in that paper, I think it's all related to mitochondria.
In place. Exactly. On the other hand, I'm also, I don't know what the timeline is, but I hope that we can have this kind of within our lifetimes. I mean, I know I'm not one of the, I know I'm not in the minority of people who would actually like to go to space at some point, but
right.
Maybe not quite there yet as far as, the amount of money needed to do a commercial space flight, I think right now is a bit astronomical. So hopefully we can see that coming down. And not a twin, but I'd like to sign up for some experiments here myself.
Yeah. Well, that's definitely. I think will happen in our lifetime. Maybe I'm overly optimistic, but I think being overly optimistic is good. But so I think that's something like this twin orbit project we're doing is eventually that's part of it, where you could make commercial viability easier because it's going to be safer. And the twin study will give that, but eventually someone who's not a twin can do that and be able to say genetically we could take or you'll be predisposed. You have these predispositions genetically if you did go to space, for example, for some health risk. So would you want to go? You can decide that yourself, right? Exactly. Right now we don't know predispositions. We have ideas, but we don't have it like nailed down. If you have these X mutations or genes in your body being dysregulated, I would say right now, if you have mitochondrial related suppression or diseases in your body, you're probably not going to do as well in space. Just like COVID.
Not a good idea, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's already quite a bit, because space travel is pretty new. I mean, we're still struggling to kind of test those things out for some of the diseases that we've known about for centuries. So it's really exciting. I think the fact that people are looking so closely at the data from astronauts and also these models is really, really exciting.
I think one thing I think aspect of, before I forget, is space travel, the commercial thing that that will be kind of more advantageous than the current things that are done by NASA and other space agencies. That you got to consider that right now all the astronauts that all these space agencies use to send to space, they're like the top 0.001% physically fit and health wise, they're the most healthiest people in the world basically, right. Which is good. But if you want to send normal people like me, up there, I'm not that 0.001%. I think I'm healthy, but I'm average, health wise probably. So how does that going to affect the average population like you and me, that's out there for health? And commercial, I think, is going to push that more and more to that direction. So then, as you said, now we got, you don't have to be that physically 0.01% healthy population on Earth. You could be just a normal person on the street, and then you're okay to go to space and figure out what's going to happen to you.
Exactly. At least figure out who would be okay to go to space.
Exactly.